in this presentation, myself and my colleague Paul Smith are going to be looking at the impact of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture by finishing beef cattle at earlier ages. And it's probably one of those measures that has received a huge amount of attention. We know that it has potential to reduce emissions. So in this slide, what I want to look at, or in this set of slides, just to what extent and how are we performing so far relative to the expectations. So I suppose firstly, in terms of the key concept of why should we aim to reduce finishing age at all? Well, there are two maybe principal drivers. The first one, and the overarching one from the principle of the climate change agenda, is that it does reduce emissions. If we look at, for example, a piece of work carried out by myself and a colleague, David Kelly, now at ICBF, we were looking at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's inventory. And if we look at that, and this is just for one of the categories, there are many other categories, but they pretty much say the same thing. Where we reduce finishing age, we have a very clear and sustained reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we can see here going from animals that are 34 months of age and older at slaughter, right down to animals at 16 to 18 months, 18 to 20 months, and so on. So a very clear impact on finishing age within the national population. From a farm perspective, and this is absolutely key to any measure that we try to achieve deployment at farm level, what impact does it have on profitability? And this is one of the measures where there is a very clear win-win. So reducing finishing age either for suckler or dairy beef animals, or either in the second winter or during the third grazing season, or indeed if we looked at this for the second grazing season, has a very strong impact on improving profitability. Clearly, it's less so in the third grazing season insofar as the cost of feeding is much less, but you can see there is a slight improvement in margin per livestock unit where you reduce finishing age. So a very positive win-win scenario in terms of reducing finishing age. If we look at why what are the key drivers of reducing emissions by reducing finishing age? Well, the key driver is from the perspective of manure and enteric methane emissions. If we look at the profile of emissions from the Irish agri-food sector, we can see that enteric methane accounts for about 65% of total emissions. If we add manure methane to that, it's closer to 75% of total emissions from the agri-food sector. So where we finish animals earlier, obviously they're not alive for a greater duration, and therefore enteric methane is less. And also they're producing slurry for a shorter duration. So manure methane is less. So a very clear indication of the concept underpinning reducing greenhouse gas emissions by reducing finishing age. So what was our target? If we look at the Teagasc margin abatement cost curve that was published last year, and we have a number of measures that have an effect on reducing emissions. Reducing age at finishing, we set a likely or a potential target of 3-month reduction by 2030 relative to 2018, our climate baseline. That would leave us with an abatement of in the order of 730 kilotons in 2030. So about 13% of the required reduction within the agri-food sector, so 13% of the 5.75 million tonnes of emissions reduction required can be achieved by reducing finishing age by 3 months. And 3 months is a very ambitious target, and certainly was at that time. As you'll see in a few slides forward, it's even more ambitious now. But it was also one that we felt at the time, with the right incentives and with the right policy measures and with the right deployment of technology at farm level, was possible. So how are we progressing? Well, the first thing is, if we look historically, going from 2012 to 2021, so look at that 10-year period, we achieved just shy of a week's reduction in finishing age per year. A greater reduction in the first half of that period, about 9 days. The second half of that period reduced to about 4 days. But we were achieving sustained reductions. One of the key questions we often get asked, what impact will that have on carcass weight? Well, that week per year over that 10-year period, so about a 70-day reduction, was actually achieved with little or no reduction in carcass weight. If we look across the board, with the exception of the dairy beef steers, our suckler beef heifers increased by 19 kilos. Suckler beef steers, little change, a slight increase. And our bulls, slight increase as well on the dairy beef side. So we actually had no reduction and a very slight increase. And in fact, over that 10-year period, our total beef output increased by about 14%. So, it is possible to reduce finishing age with the right level of, measures adopted at farm level, while also maintaining carcass weight at a minimum. So let's look at since 2018, because obviously, our climate baseline in 2018 relative to where we got to in 2022 and what happened last year in 2023. So our baseline, our average finishing age was 26 months. We were achieving about 4.5 days a year reduction up to 2022, short of what we were maybe expecting and hoping to achieve, but on a par with what had been achieved prior to that. In 2023, we actually returned back to our 2018 levels. A couple of reasons for that. I think one thing we don't need to be reminded of is the really challenging weather conditions that prevailed in 2013. The warmest year, we had the wettest month, we had the stormiest season, kind of everything from a weather perspective that could go wrong from an animal performance point of view did go wrong. So clearly that had a very sizable impact. The other element of this, if you look at the numbers, and we won't go into it in any great detail, but in 2018, the percentage of our male kill as bulls was about 23%. So about 23% of our males were killed as bulls. And clearly you can see when males are killed as bulls, finishing age in 2018, about 8 months younger, that had reduced. The percentage in 2023 had reduced to 14%. So we had much lower bull kill relative to the total population. If we corrected for the bull kill, in other words, if we had the same proportion of our males killed as bulls in 2023, our mean finishing age would have been 25.6 as well. So there's a combination of factors at work here. There is a reduction in the male kill as bulls, and there also is the inclement weather that prevailed in that year. So what does that mean then for our projections, if you like? Going back to the MAC curve, we had anticipated or projected a 3-month reduction by 2030, achieving an abatement of 730 kilotons. If we actually look at where we were trending downwards, as I said, not at the level we might have expected, but we certainly were trending downwards. And we've had a sharp correction in 2023 for the reasons I gave a moment ago. So clearly on a business as usual, we are certainly not at the level we would have expected us to be at. So we expected our moderate scenario and the high scenario to be at 22.9 months and 21.6 months respectively. If we take that new baseline for 2023, our business as usual will give us 25.6 months, which is some bit away from where we would have liked to have been. And even our high scenario is 1.3 months older than we had in our MAC projections, and indeed in the numbers that were presented for the Food Vision Committee. So 1.3 months is, we still have to pull all the detailed numbers together in terms of the various animal groups, what's been achieved across those different animal groupings in terms of ages and numbers within the animal groups. But you're probably looking at something in the order of 250 kilotons less in terms of our abatement relative to what we had in the MAC curve. So what are we doing to try and address this? Well, we have a couple of major new projects. I'm just going to present one of those called BeefQuest, which is a solution-orientated framework for reducing the finishing age of Irish beef cattle. It's a 4-year Teagasc-led project funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and a number of objectives. But essentially what we want to do is firstly characterise in detail the live weight gain performance of the national beef herd. We know pretty much our starting point, in terms of birth weights and in some cases performance up to weaning. And we know the end point. We know carcass weights, and we can, with a reasonable level of confidence, reverse engineer that into a final weight, a slaughter weight. But what we don't know is what happens in between that. Where are we missing targets along the lifetime and along the growth curve of beef cattle? So we want to characterise that. We then want to quantify the effects of nutrition, animal health, and the on-farm environment on finishing age on contrasting production systems. So, number one, characterize what's happening, and number two, try to explain why that's happening. We want to understand the behavior of farmers, or in other words, why certain measures get adopted at farm level and why some don't. Some of that we might speculate around economics, around practicality, and so on. But we want to, if you like, work closely with a very wide spectrum of farmers across the different, systems of production, different regions of the country, and different farm backgrounds to see what drives behavioural change, or in other words, what drives adoption. A little bit like we did for the MAC curve and for other exercises, we want to model different options in terms of the measures that farmers can adopt. What impact does that have on economics and financial performance, on greenhouse gas emissions, and on other environmental traits at farm level? And pulling all this together to formulate a roadmap for policymakers and for the wider agri-food sector on the most effective means of reducing the national finishing age. Again, recapping on that, the national finishing age is on average about 6 months older than our high-performing commercial farms. We know what those sources of variations are: animal genetics, gender, beef system, diet, number of movements, animal health. We know in general what are the key factors driving finishing age and live weight performance on farm. But what we need is commercial farm data to prioritise and maybe to put a little bit more detail around to what extent are each of those factors impacting on live weight performance on farms, on finishing age, and on profitability. So just in summary, if we pull all that together, we know finishing age is a key measure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve profitability on beef farms at commercial level. I certainly would make the point that where you are at a very efficient production system, there is a strong argument not to reduce finishing age any further. But certainly if we look at the commercial average finishing age in the order of 6 months older than the best practice farmers, there is opportunities there, and there are opportunities there. Key drivers, look at carcass weight specification and price incentives. They have been the key driver in historically and remain the key driver. What incentivizes farmers to make change? It's price impacts. We need strong advisory messages, genetic improvement, clearly supplementary feeding at the right time, judicious supplementary feeding, and herd health programs. Year-on-year reductions were being achieved up to 2022, albeit with a slower rate of reduction. That has tailed off in 2023 and it pretty much reversed in 2023, largely due to inclement weather conditions and changes in the male cattle slaughter profile. And because of that, we are now back at on average 2018 levels. We have recently commenced a number of projects, but in particular the DAFM-funded BeefQuest project to explore on-farm challenges to reduce finishing age. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll leave it at that. But I suppose the simple summary is a very strong measure. We're making progress. A bit of a tailback now. More work to be done.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that. Very quick question for you, just in case the audience haven't managed to ask a question. What can farmers do now on their own farms to maybe try and really speed up or reduce the age of finishing and have animals finishing earlier?
I think a key one is to have a plan of production, if you like. So what I mean by that is that every farm has different groups of animals performing at different rates and genetics, health, things like that. So for each group of animals, each cohort on the farm, to have a plan of finishing for those animals, or a plan of trading for those animals. So for instance, if animals in midsummer, if you can break up your cohort of beef cattle into the maybe more fleshy, more forward type animals, they could be potentially finished off pasture with supplementation. There might be more store type cattle that need to go back into the shed. So in other words, it's assigning animals to different production systems at a reasonably early stage in their lifetime, so that they are then put onto the required diet in order them to meet those finishing targets. Earlier in the lifetime, look at herd health is key, I think. We're now going into a period of housing. level of ventilation in the housing, penning, space allowance, feed space at the barrier. All of these have key impacts during the housing period. Feed quality is important. It's obviously too late now. What's in the pit is in the pit, and that's what will be fed. But having some indication of the quality of that feed, and then supplementing as required, so that we achieve the level of weight gain that's necessary in order to keep our animals on track.
Thank you, Paul.